So I think we'll get started, and my colleague will keep letting people in. But good morning and afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the CHFCA and Thomas Thor. In this webinar, we'll be discussing how workforce planning can de-risk major projects and transformations in the hydrogen industry, as well as provide a competitive advantage. My name is Turney. I'm the Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association, and I'm speaking to you today from Edmonton, Alberta, which is the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of many First Nations, such as the Cree, Dene, Anishinaabe, and Blackfoot. For those of you who are not familiar with the CHFCA, we are a national industry association established in 2009 with a history that spans over 50 years. With regional affiliates in BC, Alberta, Ontario, we support our members with advocacy, communications, networking, and government relations. We represent over 200 companies, academia, consultancies, research agencies, and end users who are developing, demonstrating, and deploying hydrogen and fuel cell technologies. If your company is not yet a part of the CHFCA, please do reach out to us to learn more about how you can join, and we would be happy to provide more information. Just some housekeeping rules before I hand it over to our guest presenters from Thomas Thor. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and held in accordance with the CHFCA's competition law compliance policy. We kindly request all participants to refrain from discussing confidential business information. Please be sure to keep your microphones on mute and feel free to enter any questions that you may have in the chat section. We will be sure to get to your questions during the Q&A segment following the presentation. Now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our guest presenters from Thomas Thor today, Callum Thomas, the founder and chair, and Ruth Steele, the president of the North American division. Please feel free to share your screen now.
Perfect. Thank you, Tony. And hello, everyone. I'm joining you from Amsterdam this evening, and Ruth is joining us from
Boston, Massachusetts, in the USA. Okay. Hello, everyone.
And Laurie?
I'm in the Cleveland, Ohio area, so we're all over.
Great. Okay, so we're here today to talk about workforce planning, which is a vast topic. So I think let's just kick off with who are we and why are we talking about this topic? So we're a business, Thomas Thor. Our executive search division is Thor Executive, as you can see behind Laurie on the wall there in the office. Our job is building and sustaining the global workforce focused on energy transition mainly. And we're looking at nuclear energy, we're looking at all kinds of renewable energy, we're looking at hydrogen and storage and batteries, basically all of the stakeholders that are involved in achieving net zero and clean energy system. We are the organization that helps them find and retain people. So workforce planning is core to what we do because we need to understand the talent pool. We need to be able to help organizations bring people in to deliver their projects. And many of the clients we work for are project led. And so having the right people at the right time is critical. And knowing exactly when you need those people is not always easy, as we'll come to when we talk about one of our sections today. So our business is in Europe, in North America, both the US and Canada, and over in the Middle East. So we really have a global view, and many of the clients we work with are interested in hiring internationally as well as nationally. Ruth, would you want to add anything to the intro to us before? I'm conscious of the time we've got, so I want us to get into our topic, but what else would you want to add?
No additions to our introduction. You can jump right in. Thank you.
Okay. Great. And Tony kindly introduced Ruth and myself, but Laurie, who you can also see on your screen, is Laurie. Would you care to briefly introduce yourself as well, please?
Sure. I am the director of Net Zero North America, and we work with the Canadian Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association, and we're happy to be here. That's what I do.
Perfect. Thanks, Laurie. Okay, we have a manageable group size here today, so we really want this to be interactive. What this is not going to be is a lecture where you come away with reams and reams of slides and notes. We want to spark conversation. Workforce planning, as we said in the synopsis for this webinar, any executive or leader you speak to will talk about people being the most important part of their organization. And planning for your future workforce and building your future workforce is obviously so crucial to the success of an organization. And workforce planning is the term used for a whole set of strategies around that. And it's far too broad to go into in one webinar. So we've come up with 4 areas that we want to talk about today that come under the umbrella of workforce planning. The first one is about managing uncertainty, especially when you're delivering projects or when you're waiting for regulatory approvals, etc. It's extremely hard to know exactly when you will need the people. So how do you manage those uncertainties in workforce projections and workforce planning? The second area is around understanding the talent pool. Knowing where the individuals are that you want to attract, knowing how to communicate them, knowing what they're looking for, and how you are different to another employer. It's very easy to create a workforce model or workforce plan that has numbers in it. But when you try and apply that, there are so many variable factors that come in, and so many things change that might make it more or less attractive for people to join your organization. So we'll talk about understanding the talent pool. We'll talk about whether you develop people, train them from scratch, or whether you hire people with experience, or whether you buy talent or skill from the supply chain or suppliers. And then the final one we'll talk about is challenging norms and assumptions. There's a lot of evolution going on in the workforce right now, and which will continue into the future. So what is happening and how can we manage that? Because that has a huge knock-on effect to workforce planning as well. So I said this was going to be interactive. So we're going to kick off with the first topic, and we're going to have a poll question. So I'm going to ask Tony if you wouldn't mind sharing the poll question. At the top of your screen, along with the chat and Q&A, etc., you should see a poll. So if you could click on that. I'm going to share my screen as well, and we'll come on to the first section. Has the poll come up? No.
Yes, the poll is
Yes,
coming.
I can see the poll. I can see the poll in front of me, Callum. So far, 20% of people are saying less than 1 year, 60% are saying 1 to 3 years, and 20% are saying 3 to 5 years. We've not had a response for more than 5 years at this point. We've had 10 responses, so there's still plenty of people to respond. If you don't see the poll, maybe raise your hand, and maybe Tony can look into that.
If you're on browser, please click into the chat and you'll see the poll.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, when I shared my screen, I couldn't see it. So how far into the future do you feel able to create accurate workforce projections? Yes, 80% of people under 3 years and 40% under a year. And we think this is fairly typical. I don't know, Ruth, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I'd say that is representative of the feedback we would get from most of our clients, is that they feel that just over a year to 2 years is where they feel that they can project, but beyond that, it becomes very grey. Yeah,
okay. So let's please feel free to ask questions as we go along. We will try and answer questions. Feel free also to turn your video on if you want to ask the question. It's not a gigantic group, so feel free to speak on video. But Ruth and I and Larry will just talk about a few of the themes and trends we see around managing uncertainty, and then we'll open it to questions. Maybe I start with the basics. I think it's very common. Most organizations that we're working with are struggling to see more than 1 to 2 years ahead in terms of workforce planning, which makes it incredibly difficult. If you think about working on engineering projects and the lead times for components or machinery, you can predict that, in many occasions a lot easier than you can predict the workforce. But what we do see that works is working with scenarios and triggers. So it could be that you cannot predict exactly when you'll need people, but you know what the triggers will be, whether it's a regulatory approval or whether it's an investment decision, or whether it's a milestone within the project itself, and then be ready for that. Now, unfortunately, what we also see in many occasions is that that doesn't really happen that well. And then when the regulatory approval comes, or when the investment comes, it's a mad rush. It's an absolute mad rush. Right, we need people immediately. And of course, when you're in a rush, it's hard to find the right people. It's really hard to hit your diversity objectives, because you just have to try and find the people as quickly as possible. And it's clearly not the best way to do it. So scenarios and triggers is part of the basic. And then the investment in preparation. So you may not know exactly when you'll need people, but if you know the types of people that you're looking for, and can communicate with them and build some kind of relationship, maybe providing email updates or a newsletter to people that are in the catchment area or that have the right types of skills, then there is a slightly warm connection when the trigger is hit and you start to need to hire. I'd say the challenge there is always, how much do we invest? So if we're not sure when the next stage is going to come, it's not really possible to invest a huge amount in hiring people or preparing. So what we often see is a kind of a cost benefit analysis here. So what can you do that's not too expensive or time consuming, but actually gets you a little bit further along the road to being able to hire the right people and to achieve your quality objectives and also diversity objectives. And this is where things like talent pooling can really come in handy, because it's not a huge investment. You don't need to hire people. It's just about starting to do the outreach and building the community, and starting to do some engagement. Yeah, the benefits. Maybe Booth, you want to talk about this, because obviously we see when this goes well and we see when it doesn't go so well. So maybe some of the kind of the benefits when it goes well and the issues that come up when it doesn't.
Yeah, so just going back a little bit to what you were saying around talent pooling, I think where the real win is here is that because we don't know with a great degree of accuracy when we're going to pull the trigger to hire, I think we shouldn't see talent pooling as something that we do sporadically. It should be part of a company strategy to identify at all times the talent available to them and the talent that's out there. And I think that is about setting yourself up for opportunistic hires at any time, whether or not you have a project timeline approaching or not. And I think you can do that by having great staffing partnerships, by having a good internal referral program, for example. And there's a number of ways that you can talent pool using strategies that are probably in action in every single employer, but perhaps don't get the focus that they need in order to keep them active enough to be able to index on them in a quicker way. And I think there's lots of different ways, and I'm sure we'll get to them during our presentation here, including how to connect with our network and how to connect with our local network and our international talent network of particular skill sets, and looking at mentoring programs and looking at our competitors and so on. So I think the benefit of making sure that you do this is not one-dimensional, it's multi-dimensional, because it leads to better employer brand, which is good for your current internal employees as well as good for future employees. It's also good for your local community, for you to have a good employer brand. People who don't even work for you can feel proud to have you as part of their local infrastructure and being part of their local community. So I think that there's a myriad benefits to getting this part right.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I can't see any questions on the chat, but does anyone want to put their hand up, or has anyone got anything they want to talk about? Anyone want to make any comments on how you're managing uncertainty, or struggling to manage uncertainty at the moment? Then feel free to contribute. Someone else joining. I think on the probably while people think if they want to ask anything, another thing around the talent pooling is, I mean, Ruth touched on it, is the ability to be able to create roles for people is massively enhanced if there is a competence-based approach to hiring, and you're looking for people that match the values and the mission of the organization, rather than people for very, very specific roles. But we're going to come on to that shortly. So, okay. So that's our first topic. Let's. I don't see any questions, so let's move on to our second topic, which is kind of integral to everything. But let's go into it in more detail. This is about understanding the talent pool. Yeah, so knowing where the individuals are that you want to hire, how to communicate with them, what would motivate them to join you, and what your competitors are doing to attract them away, so that when you do start looking to hire, then you kind of have an understanding of how hard it's going to be and where to put your efforts. So we have another poll question here. Tony, would you mind sharing the next poll? Okay, so how confident are you that you will be able to attract the people that you need in the coming years? Are you absolutely certain, quite confident, maybe, but have doubts, or not at all confident? Okay, well, so far, we're not suffering from over-optimism in this group. I think that's, nobody is absolutely certain. Just over a third of people are quite confident, and about 2/3 of people either are not confident at all or have doubts. Well, the first thing to say is you're not alone, because much like the difficulty in managing uncertainty and predicting the timescales in the future, yeah, understanding the talent pool and really being certain that you're going to find the right people is incredibly difficult. So thank you for answering the poll. Again, please feel free to throw any questions into the chat as we go through this. Ruth, do you want to start, or shall I start with some observations here?
Sure, I could start. I think some companies do a really good job of knowing who they are. And that's the first step, is really identifying what makes you attractive as a company. And if you're not sure, one obvious way to do it is to ask the people that work for you right now. Why do you like working here? When I'm coaching our clients for interviewing, I always tell them that a really great introduction when they're introducing themselves is to say, my name is Ruth Steele, I work for Thomas Thor, and what I love about working here is. And by doing that, by asking your own staff to index on what they love about working there, everyone will have a different thing that makes them tick about working for your organization. And you can get a lot of very useful information just from that employee survey. So that's step one, is to understand what makes you attractive to your current audience. You can also ask any candidate that's coming in for interview as well, what attracted you to come in today, or what attracted you to apply for the job that you applied for. It's very important to understand what you're projecting out into the skill community, because sometimes you're projecting something that you're not aware of. So I'd say an audit of what currently exists for you is the critical first step. And then after that, it's deciding if there's a delta between what you would like to project and what you are currently projecting. So if you are trying to push yourself out there into the community in a particular way, but you're failing to do so because it isn't landing with your current employers, or you don't think it's landing with potential candidates coming in, it's about having definitive strategy to address that delta. What do we need to do as an organization to appear outwardly as the kind of employer that we would like to be? And that's using strategies such as, if you are trying to hire a more diverse group of people, when people are coming in for interview, making sure your interview panel is representative of the company that you would like to be. Even if your diversity quantities in your current situation are not where you would like them to be, make sure your panels showcase the diversity you would like, because that is a far more likely appealing vision to a diversity candidate than if you present a panel that is very non-representative to the community that you're trying to source from. So there's a couple of just sort of starting sound bites that I think are critical in this area. Callum, what would you add here?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I think probably the first thing I wanted to talk about was how the talent pool is not one group of people. There are lots of different audiences within it, and they want very much different things. And it could be people earlier in their career might be interested in working internationally and are most interested in maybe the remuneration and the speed of progression. It might be that people in the middle of their career now, we see probably those are the ones that are most motivated right now by flexibility. In fact, everyone seems to be motivated by flexibility now. We'll come on to that a bit later, but flexibility means different things to different people. And then we've got this, one of the most fascinating parts of the workforce for me now are the people which would traditionally been seen as retirees or semi-retired or getting towards retirement age. And I think retirement is a bit of an old-fashioned concept now. What we're seeing is this huge population of people aged 55 to 75 or even 80 who are in great health and want to work. And there is a lot of ageism out there still at the moment. And this is a demographic that have got a lot to give. And if we look across the energy sector, they're doing a lot of work, and they're a little bit of the unsung heroes in a way in the workforce, because there's a lot of talk about making room for the next generations to come through. But actually at the moment, what we have is a skill shortage, and there's a huge population there. So and what they need or want more likely would be probably working part-time. They're more interested in contribution and giving something back than they are in promotion and career progression, for example, but wanting to work flexibly and possibly remotely. So understanding that the talent pool is not homogenous, and that you need to understand the different groups and then communicate with each of those groups is a great place to start. And then making sure your job descriptions, I mean, this is again based back to basics, that they actually are attractive to those kind of people, because sometimes we'll work with organizations and they're amazing, the opportunities are fantastic, but you read the job spec and it doesn't come through. And so maybe it's putting people off, but perhaps even worse, you're not mentioning things or not emphasizing things that would really attract people. So I think by engaging with the talent pool and by understanding that it's different demographics and figuring out which demographics are could work within your team, and then having a distinct approach to each of them works.
One other thing that I would add there as well is it's absolutely critical that you understand what is going on in your competitive landscape as well. As Callum alluded to at the very beginning of this, there is, an evolution in talent and hiring, and there has been since really the pandemic really shifted the workforce into thinking more innovatively about how we engage with our employer and how we engage with work. You have to keep an eye on what your competitors are doing, because one move by one competitor can dramatically shift the landscape as to whether or not you are still an employer of choice. If your major competitor goes fully remote, and remote is a win for a perceived win for candidates in your sector, then suddenly you aren't the employer of choice anymore and your competitor is. So I think it's very important that you keep your eyes open as to what your competitors are doing and whether or not that's positively or negatively impacting your chances of hiring. I gave the example there of becoming remote, but it can even be down to if your employer has a meaningful shift in their the language or their employer brand, or they change their website, or they make it more attractive, or they change their search engine optimization strategy that's suddenly pushing them to the top of every search in your sector. These small changes by a competitor can really strongly impact how many applicants you're getting for a job, and therefore how many interviewees that you have for a job as well. So it's important that you have an ongoing benchmarking activity to your competitive landscape. And I also think how you view your competitors and how you think about them is really important as well. I often find myself advising my clients to think of their competitors as donor organizations, and to think about themselves as the same, a donor organization, because at some point you're going to donate a member of your staff to your competitor, and at some point they're going to donate a member of their staff to you. And if you think about a donation as a quid pro quo, you will start to have a better and more healthy relationship with talent and your competitors, because people are no longer working at one site for their whole career. They will jump around, and we have to have a much more healthy attitude to our employees going to our competitors and vice versa.
Yeah. A common question that we get asked is, what are the practical things you can do to quickly increase the diversity in your hiring or in your organization? And yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to say there is no silver bullet solution to this. And the reality is it takes more time and more effort. So if you're looking to reach people that are in traditionally underrepresented groups in your workforce, then it's going to take more time for the outreach and to actually connect and communicate with these people, because quite possibly they have no idea the industry even exists. And I think we see it across, you see it in tech, you see it in energy, you see it in most organizations that are bringing people from a STEM background, mainly, where, you know, for example, the female representation in the workforce is way under 50%, and it's not reflective of the population. And I think generally the investment then, it needs the time and resources need to be put in if you're going to find those people. But you know, what's really difficult to see is when there's a really big organization that's trying to change, and it's very, very slow process. What's exciting to see is when an organization is growing, especially when it's a project organization where the growth is quite quick, that if you get that right, if the investment up front, we talked about that, the preparation, if you understand who you want to attract and where they are and what they're looking for, and you can design the work environment around what those people want, then you'll find the diversity is a lot easier to attract. And we've seen, you know, there's a great example in the UK, a nuclear waste organization. It's gone up to 500 staff, and they have a gender balance within their workforce. And it's been done because they were able to build from scratch with the right kind of investment and the right planning. But you see other organizations with 1,000 staff that have historically had low representation of females in their workforce, and they're really struggling to change. So I know a lot of people in the hydrogen sector are in this kind of exciting growth phase, and with projects coming, it's a massive opportunity. So it's some really good news there.
Yeah, and I also think that it's really important to take a healthy attitude to diversity, and that means that you as a company have to ensure that you genuinely believe in diversity, and it's not just on your website or something that you say or something that you're trying to meet because it makes you look good on paper. You have to walk the talk, and that means investing in underrepresented groups before you try to hire them. Right, it's about engaging with those groups on a long-term basis, investing in those groups, speaking to those groups, inviting those groups into your organization even before you plan to start hiring. It feels disingenuous to just dip into those communities in order to make a couple of hires and then disappear again. You've got to be speaking to these communities on an elongated basis, and you've got to start engaging with them at every possible opportunity, whether that is through speaking to underrepresented groups at schools in your local community or at universities in your local community, as well as engaging in broader groups internationally, depending on what you're trying to hire. But I do think it's a long-term commitment, and it's not just about hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, time is racing along. So do we have any questions? I don't see anything in the chat, but if anyone has any question, feel free to put up your hand or to put it in the chat as we go along. Let's see if we've got any questions coming in. We haven't yet. So I think we'll move on to the third topic. We'll have time for questions at the end, so we invite you all to think of them then and put them forward. But this is such a personal topic, actually. Each organization has its own identity, its own challenges, its own situation. So feel free to ask questions that are relevant to your situation. It's what we're trying to do is point out some of the things that we see generally in the trends, but we're more than happy to answer specific questions. So feel free. Okay, the third area: develop, hire, or buy. Do you develop people from scratch? Do you hire in the people with the skills and experience and competencies you need? Or do you buy resources from the supply chain? So yeah, categorizing job families on whether you'll develop, hire or buy is not generally very wide practice, but it works really, really well. And I think here, if you look at, if you compare this to the kind of the technical area, engineering, for example, this sophistication around the planning for a component or a machine is immense. And you've got long lead items, and you've got all of this thinking and process around physical things, but we generally don't have anything like that in in the people space. And so we advocate for doing that, for taking the same approach and actually taking a long-term and more of a process-driven approach. But the question here is develop, hire, or buy. So we have another poll question here. Tony, if you wouldn't mind bringing it up, please. This is our final poll question of the day, so make it count. Okay, so it's a simple question. Do you have an effective practice of analysing job roles or job families to decide whether you develop, hire, or buy? Okay. So about half of us sometimes, a third not, and then 1 out of 10 is a yes. So congratulations to you. I wonder if you also work in engineering or a technical space and got best practice from there. Did anyone? I'll throw this out here actually. Someone who said yes there. Would you care to share your experience with the group? Bruce. Yeah, go ahead, please, Bruce. Do I have to?
You're on mute.
Hang on, Bruce. You're on mute. Let's try and unmute you.
Oh, we got it.
Oh yeah. No,
You're still on mute. You just have to unmute yourself.
I thought
Yeah.
I had it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
I'll start again. You hit the nail on the head there in regard to my background. So Bruce Wilson, Thor Hydrogen. You stole my name, but never mind. My background is Shell, and the analysis of your job description is so important. So really understanding what you're hiring for is quite huge. Now we're small, and yeah, I would say, although we have an approach to analyzing exactly what a job entails as a small company, and I wanted to add this to the chat. As a small company, you're looking for individuals who can really stretch across a very broad area. And I think in the discussion, you've really got to control for that. The size of the company is really important. The geography, and if we're talking Canada here, the geography is very important. Are you Toronto, or like me, are you in the Kootenay region of British Columbia, which is has a very low population? That's important too. But it really is important to analyze your job description, have a very complete understanding of that, and then have a conversation with candidates that said, but we're going to expect you to go in X, Y, Z different directions. So yeah, that's my perspective. And also, I think congratulations for recognizing that very specific demographic, the 55 plus, who, from my perspective, have an awful lot to offer, but I think are, very underrepresented in terms of job descriptions. In fact, you'll see many job descriptions setting a ceiling on experience that might be 15, 20 years. I just don't get that. So that's
well, it's actually not legal in most countries, but you still see it. So yeah, Bruce, you may be interested in a book that I just read. It's called Stage Not Age, and it's written by someone at Harvard, I think. And it's all about how we shouldn't look at age at all. We should look at what stage people are in, and people might be in this kind of pioneering, adventuring, entrepreneurial phase, or in a you know, a less risk kind of taking phase, and you might have a 70-year-old who is in exactly the same stage as a 25-year-old. They're basically they're not looking for security right now. They're looking to contribute and to learn and to, you know, so it's all about looking at people in terms of demographics, in terms of stages rather than age. So
very important. Yeah, they could be just as driven as a 20-something.
Well, yeah, and sorry, Ruth, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to draw on something else that Bruce alluded to, which I think is critical, is you've got to understand who you are as an organization, and that encompasses so many things like geography, like age of your company, whether you're a startup, whether you are a very well-established company, whether you've got a great reputation, whether you've got a slightly poor reputation. All things are possible. But when you are a company that may be geographically in a difficult spot, it requires you to even dig a bit deeper than just knowing your job. It's actually knowing more than just the job. It's not what is this job now, it's what has this job been before, what could this job be in the future, and what are the jobs surrounding this job. And being very flexible to the idea that although you set out thinking this was a job for one person to do, that it actually could be split down into 3 different jobs with different components, and you can pull in from other pieces of your company to make it 3 jobs. And maybe those 3 jobs will end up costing you more on the short term, but your investment in 3 people, bringing 3 people into a small organization, can have cultural investment and cultural significance, because you've got to get to a critical mass with people sometimes in order to create a culture that then is attractive to other people to come in. So it's actually it's not a simplistic one-dimensional do you know your job that you're trying to hire for. It's actually digging a bit deeper than that when you're a smaller organization, or where you have difficult aspects of your company to meet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the kind of develop, hire, or buy, you know, basic good practice is to have triggers in place or deadlines when you change your strategy. So it might be that you're looking to hire someone to train because it's the best long-term option and probably the most cost-effective option. But what can happen sometimes, whether you're a small company or a big company, is that maybe you see 1 or 2 people to interview, and the interview process carries on, and then it's not quite right, and then you see another resume, and then you interview again, and before you know it, 4 or 5 months have gone by, and the critical path is starting to be affected. So it's about, sometimes if the responsibility falls down the gap there, and no one's actually standing up and saying, well, hang on, we really need this person in place. And that's where you may have a trigger to say, okay, if we do not have the right person to hire within 4 months, then we will look to bring in a contractor for a period of time, for example, to fill the gap. And actually, something to say on an aside is as in terms of buying skills in from the supply chain, I think a lot of organizations in remote locations have often relied on the supply chain because they're good at deploying people out to remote locations. They are really, really struggling at the moment because their organization is just like every other organization, and they struggle to attract people to work for them when they're being sent out to, you know, any location which is not really in their control. So it's becoming a bit harder to rely on the supply chain to have really good quality people, especially if they're being relocated, mobilized to another location.
I also just wanted to dive in there and say it's really about strategic agility here. As somebody wrote in the chat before, all 3, and the truth is, it is about all 3. You're probably not going to get through a hiring campaign without considering activating all 3, and being agile to quickly recognize where your strategy is not quite going the way that you wanted it to, and being able to pivot to one of the other 2, I think it certainly should be at the discussion table at all times with hiring. I see a question coming in from Pranav here, and it says, who should be involved in workforce planning aside from HR professionals? I think to answer that is anyone who has a stake in the workforce. So if you're a hiring manager of a team of individuals that are difficult to hire because your skill set is rare in the marketplace, then you, more than your HR department, right, should be involved in workforce planning, because the candidates are more likely to come to you than they are to your HR advisor. Because if you're running a team of highly skilled, rare individuals, the chances are that you yourself are a highly skilled, rare individual. So your network and your visibility in the marketplace is what might be attractive to people coming to you. So in that example, you should be absolutely involved in your workforce planning. Your HR can always provide you with a structure or a set of guidelines, but often it takes the subject matter experts to actually be engaged in that networking process to ensure that your workforce plan is enacted within the timelines that you would like.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the process of creating the workforce plan, which of course will be constantly changing. So it's not a static plan. And then there's the accountability, and the accountability, as Ruth said, is completely shared. But I go back to what Bruce is saying. If you're a small organization and you're probably looking for people to come in with a bit of an entrepreneurial spirit because they're joining a small organization, you need them to be flexible. An email from the founder or the CEO goes so much, to attracting people. So you may want to chip in and do some of the outreach to some of these people, or go out and give a talk. Just ask the question, whoever's actually doing the day-to-day work on delivering the workforce plan, how can you, if you have more of a profile, for example, how can you support that? And that's critical.
Mm.
We have another question actually here. So how can organizations plan for increased diversity if they're not sure how to reach audiences from underrepresented groups?
That is a great question. I think the first question is to sort of have a deep dive internally to discuss with your leadership team what diversity means to you as an organization. And it goes back to what I was saying before, is your internal belief mechanisms and your cultural beliefs within your company need to be clear to you so that you can be clear when you're going to these underrepresented groups about the why. And I think a lot of companies sort of gloss over that step accidentally, and they know they need diversity because everyone's talking about it, and they theoretically or on paper understand it, but they perhaps skip the part where they talk about it as a leadership team, because most leadership teams we know are not diverse. So they're not always the best at sort of discussing it internally and recognizing it. So I think that's the first step. And then if you are an underrepresented leadership team, it's about trying to reach out within your immediate networks to people who you know are from underrepresented groups and asking the question, we are trying to hire more diversity. How can we do better? How can we connect better? I also think in this day and age, if your company is of a size, a chief diversity officer or a person responsible for equity and diversity in your organization is very important. And that person should be very adept at contacting underrepresented groups and working with them to help your leadership team understand those groups and what benefits you as an organization can get from diversity from within them. So I know that's a bit of a fluffy answer, but I think there's so many examples of diversity, and each diverse group perhaps needs a slightly different strategy to access. So there's a lot of work to be done here, and it's not easy work. It's work that you have to decide as an organization is critically important to you, and you have to put money behind it and time behind it. So you could make the decision today to become X percentage diverse, and it could take you 10 years at least to meet that goal. But if you've got milestones on that journey and you're critically working toward those milestones, it goes a long way to help you attract underrepresented groups in the long term.
Yeah, and probably the smaller the organization, the easier it is to plan, because the actual, the real numbers are different. But I would add to what Ruth was saying, is just to measure. There's so much talk about inclusion and diversity that it's easy to think that it's happening. And especially at the senior leadership level, it's like, okay, we talk about it, we have a policy, we're investing in this and that, but actually, are we actually doing it? And what's, it's measuring what's actually being done. How many people are we reaching out to? Having things like having a quota for interviewees. So if you're interviewing, having a target or a quota to say, okay, how diverse should the interview pool be before you start interviewing, for example.
And you're almost diving into Sophia's question here. Do you recommend
Yeah.
setting specific goals when it comes to diversity, as in a percentage of your workforce or new hires? I think that is an option. But as Callum says, it could be as simple as requiring it if you're working with talent pools, or you're working with interviewing groups, requiring that a percentage of the candidates that are introduced to you are within a diversity band. I think that is becoming quite common practice these days as well. And setting aside budget as well for access to diversity groups, because we know it takes longer and it's more expensive to try to source from diversity groups because they're harder to reach. So making sure that you are recognizing that when going out to market, I think, is important.
Yeah. Okay, and I think I'm conscious of the time. We're going to need to move on to our fourth area, but the final thing I'd say there is perhaps what can cause friction is when you say, okay, we're going to hire a woman for this role, for example, because then it can cause an issue with the person hired, because they can feel like they were hired because they're a woman, and it can also cause resentment in the organization, and that person may not settle in or be accepted. So I think those kind of targets can be risky, but having a target or a quota to say, when we interview, at least half or at least a third, or at least a half the people we interview will be from underrepresented groups, then that works, because then you're interviewing people from all groups, and then you're making a decision.
And I would add that if you've built in an anti-bias interview process, then that method works. But it doesn't work in independence. You do have to look at your interview strategy as well and make sure it's anti-bias.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could do a whole webinar on this, couldn't we, Ruth? And I know you've done loads of work in this area, helping organizations de-bias their interview process and training people to interview. So it's a huge area. So yeah, we're happy to answer questions or even help you with that after this webinar if you'd like us to. So let's move to our fourth. We've got another question, but before we answer that, let's move to our fourth topic, which is challenging the norms and assumptions. So whether it's having remote employees, or whether it's hiring internationally, or whether it's radically changing job descriptions or designing the working experience, keeping up with what people want and what motivates the people that you want to attract is really, really important. So maybe Ruth and I can just cover a few things that we're seeing out there, and then we really would value your questions on this, because there's so many interesting things happening out there. It's always good to learn. So maybe I'll kick it off, Ruth, and then we can bat through a couple of these. So the first one is obviously everyone wants more flexibility now, and flexibility means different things to different people. One way we've seen to handle this is organizations setting up locations in other places, and it could be a very small location or a bigger location, but just going to where the people are, because although people want flexibility, they generally want to have a kind of human interaction and a social scene. So having everyone working 100% remote, the research is not yet strong enough, but it looks like that's quite a tricky policy for many organizations. So thinking about the locations, and even as a small location, to have another hub in a center of a city or in a different country even it's happening now. It's happening all over the place. So Ruth.
Yeah, to add to that, I think where companies have had to invest in this remote working because of all sorts of reasons. I think it's really important to also invest in your travel policy. And you've got to make some really key decisions about what togetherness means for your organization. And you've got to stand by that strategy. So if togetherness for your organization means that teams are together physically 4 times a year, and in those 4 times a year, the following things happen, then you have to enact that. And I would say that the pandemic taught us that we can be flexible and that remote can work and that we can get productivity at very high levels from remote workers. But what it also taught us is that disconnection from our colleagues can be destructive to our overall cultural goals as an organization. So trying to find where the sweet spot is with togetherness and trying to discuss that with your employees, I think can be a really good way of building a new type of culture that values togetherness for specific goals. And flexibility is about a combination of culture and strategy. And so those two things have to dovetail. And the only way you get that real good dovetail is by reaching out to your employees and understanding how they see it and what's important for them. So that's one thing. I also think that what I see particularly in Canada is a lot of our clients recognizing that there are abundant competition trying to hire for the same skill sets, and that Canada just cannot reduce the number of that skill set that is required by the number of companies that are requiring it. So hiring international or hiring from outside of Canada is a critical goal. And it's not that difficult and it's not that big a hurdle if you put time and energy and effort into understanding what that model looks like and knowing where in your workforce to apply that model. So I think there's some research that has to be done by every organization to identify what international relocation looks like, or seconding people to other locations, or indeed having a hub outside of your home country to hire people in where that strength set is more abundant. So that's another thing that I see a lot of at the moment.
Yeah, it's worth saying that we regularly move people from the US and from all over Europe to Canada. There is a good immigration process. The visa process is quite streamlined and not too expensive. So it's actually really possible. I think, again, if you're a big company, probably you've already done it. If you're a small company, then it's probably not as difficult and as expensive as you might think. And it's very common practice. A lot of sectors are in Canada are attracting people from abroad. I think we're going to run out of time relatively soon. So Turney's probably going to jump in a second, I think, to wrap things up. But Ruth and Laurie, any final comments before we invite any final questions? Or
no, I think it'd be good to get to the questions.
Yeah. So we've got another one here. Yeah, what are some of the best practices with respect to building communities of potential future employees, which we kind of touched on a bit, but Ruth, do you want to talk a bit more?
Yeah, I've got a little list here that I put together before we came on, and it's just a quick list. One, having good staffing partnerships, so making sure you know who the staffing partners are and that you're engaged with them. You pick the correct partners and use them as partners, not as suppliers. They're partners. They should be a part of your community, and you should be discussing with them to decide if they're a partner you want to work with. Secondly, having a good internal referral program, making sure your employees are putting you in touch with their connections. Your employees are well networked. They went to college with people. They worked with people in their previous job. They know people from all walks of life, from their community, from their social scene. Make sure that you are connected to their network and that you reward them for sharing their network with you. Encouraging and hosting and or funding networking events or conferences. So showing people you're here and that you're engaged in the community, turning up for things. I know everyone hates the free pens and the swag that you get at these events, but putting your name in the hat is important, and making sure people remember you. So if you are going to a conference, make sure you're leaving people with with something to remember you by. It doesn't need to be a pen, right? It could just be a great experience they had meeting you or a member of your team. But I think networking as much as you can is a really useful tool here. Making yourself visible in the general community. So in your local community, you'd be amazed how many people think, oh, there's nobody with the skill set we need locally. Well, make sure you know that before you state it. So being active in your local community and getting your local community buy-in will help you to attract people from outside of your community as well. And then think about communities as not just the local community which you exist in geographically, but you are part of skills community. If you're a specialist company that does specialized things, then you become part of an international skill community in that domain. So it's important that you engage with those skills communities internationally. And then I think mentoring and thinking more holistically about mentoring. So have you considered, for example, seeing your competitors as an opportunity for mentoring? So would you be brave enough to reach out to your competitor and say, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. We don't have enough females in our leadership team. We see that you have 2 strong women in your senior leadership team. Would they be open to mentoring some of our people? And we will give you a quid pro quo in some other area. If you can't achieve it as a standalone company, look out to your competitors and see if community building or coalition building within your competitive landscape is possible for you as a company. So that was my list. I hope that is addresses some of the things on your question, Nicholas.
That's very comprehensive. I mean, the only one thing I'd want to add is to say that there's a difference between the reactive work of finding people and the proactive work of building communities, and it's making time for that proactive work. So I see Tony's come back on. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and we're happy to take any other questions offline after this as well. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you to everyone for attending this webinar today. And after this ends, I will be sending the recording over, as well as the contact information for Caleb and Ruth. I'm not sure if Lori, you want your contact information sent, but I can send that as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or them as well. And yeah, thank you for coming today, and hope you guys have a rest of a good day today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.